The ZACK Files, My Teacher Ate Homework. Chapter 1. Know that substitute teachers have a tough job. But does that give one the right to bite me on the butt? I guess maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is ZACK. I'm 10 and a half, and I'm in the 5th grade at the Horace Hyde White School for Boys. That's in New York City, by the way. My parents are divorced, and I spend about half my time with my dad. It's when I'm with my dad that the weird things happen. Like this time I started telling you about. My regular science and homeroom teacher, Mrs. Coleman-Levin, was out sick. Instead, we had a substitute teacher, Mrs. Wolfowitz. As soon as I saw her, I thought there was something strange about her. She was short, dark, and very hairy. There seemed to be stubble on her cheeks from shaving, but it was also on her nose and forehead. She didn't stand upright. She sort of crouched over. And when I turned in my science homework, well, I can't be sure of this, but I thought I heard her growl. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said. "Did you just growl?" She gave me an angry look. It was the wrong thing to say. I realized that as soon as I said it. "What is your name, young man?" she asked. It's ZACK." "Well, ZACK," she said, I was most certainly not growling. I was clearing my throat. "And I'd like to see you after class." "Oh. Well, that's what you get for asking a teacher if she was growling." "Okay, what's the worst she could do to me? Kick me out of class, just because I asked if she was growling? No way." When science class was over and everybody filed out of the room, I walked up to the teacher's desk. "Mrs. Wolfowitz," I said. "What did you want to see me about?" Mrs. Wolfowitz glared at me over the top of her glasses. Then she yawned. While her mouth was open, I caught a peek at her teeth. They looked a little more fongy. Then toothy. I wondered whether I should mention it. I realized it would probably be another bad mistake. "Why, Mrs. Wolfowitz, what big teeth you have," would definitely be the wrong thing to say at this point. "Did you hand in your homework?" asked Mrs. Wolfowitz. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I handed it in before class." "Then where is it?" I pointed at my homework. It was lying on her desk right in front of her. "Right there," I said. "Right where?" she said. "Right there. See?" I pointed again. She bent low over my homework. Then she did something very weird. She licked it. I decided to pretend I hadn't seen her do that. Then she did something even weirder. She opened her mouth, grabbed my homework in her enormous teeth, and began chewing it up. I watched her eat my homework without saying anything. What could I say? I was scared to mention what she was doing, but I was also scared not to. Soon, she'd pretty much eaten the whole thing. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said. "But why did you do that?" "Why did I do what?" she asked. "Eat my homework." "Don't be ridiculous," she said. "Why would I eat your homework? Are you denying you ate it?" I asked. "Absolutely," she said. "And I'll thank you not to make such insulting accusations again. I happen to be a highly respected substitute teacher. In fact, I've received awards for my substitute teaching. Schools actually hope their regular teachers will get sick, just so I can substitute for them. I knew I should let it go, but I just couldn't. Mrs. Wolfowitz, if you didn't eat my homework, then where is it? Now she was really mad. You obviously failed to bring it in, didn't you? She said. Mrs. Wolfowitz, I said quietly, you know that isn't true. Are you calling me a liar? She asked. No, ma'am. I'm just saying I brought my homework in and you ate it. Look. There's a tiny piece of it still stuck in the corner of your mouth. See? I reached up to get it. Mrs. Wolfowitz almost bit my finger off. I ran out of there before she could find any more parts of me to taste. Chapter 2. Yes, Zack, what is it? Said Mr. Underpants. He's the new principal of my school. I had gone to see him right after Mrs. Wolfowitz nearly bit my finger off. Sir, I'm having kind of a problem with my substitute teacher. Mrs. Wolfowitz? Yes, sir, I said. Fine woman, Mrs. Wolfowitz. Fine woman, said Mr. Underpants. Won awards for her substitute teaching, I hear. We've been hoping one of our teachers would get sick so she could substitute here. And Mrs. Coleman-Levin was good enough to oblige us. What sort of problem are you having with Mrs. Wolfowitz? Well, sir, she kind of ate my homework. Excuse me? I said Mrs. Wolfowitz ate my homework. Mr. Underpants frowned. That's preposterous, he said. Why on earth would Mrs. Wolfowitz eat your homework? I have no idea, I said. All I know is that she did. Well, that's poppycock, said Mr. Underpants. Sheer poppycock. Zack, I'm very disappointed in you. Coming in here and telling me such poppycock. I'd like your father to come to my office for a conference tomorrow. But, sir. Mr. Underpants checked his schedule. 8 a.m. I'd like to see you both. Oh boy. Now I was really in trouble. I was pretty sure Dad would believe that Mrs. Wolfowitz ate my homework. Still, he was going to be mad at me for making him give up valuable work time to come to school. At lunch, I told my friend Spencer everything that had happened. We were moving down the cafeteria line with our trays. I told him about how Mrs. Wolfowitz ate my homework. She scares me, I said. I mean, she has these sharp fangs and she growls. And isn't she awfully hairy for a lady? Spencer nodded. Then he checked his watch. It's a cool one that tells you the date, the phases of the moon and stuff like that. You know, there's a full moon tomorrow night, said Spencer. So? I said, moving down to desserts. I grabbed a slice of banana cream pie. So think what you just told me about Mrs. Wolfowitz, said Spencer. Mrs. Wolfowitz. Aren't you beginning to suspect she might be a werewolf? I finished Spencer's sentence. Spencer nodded. He didn't act like this was some terrible problem. He acted like I'd given him this huge gift. Zack, this is so cool, said Spencer. What's so cool about it? I asked. I paid for my lunch and started looking around for a place to sit. Well, we can follow her around with my camcorder and catch her doing something wolfy, said Spencer. Then, when Mrs. Coleman-Levin gets back, we turn in the tape for an extra credit science project. Do you realize how great that would be? A videotape of a real werewolf? We'll probably both get A+. Whoa, I said. Hang on a second. All I said was that Mrs. Wolfowitz ate my homework, that's all. And that she's kind of strange looking. Zack, said Spencer, how well do I know you? As well as anybody, I guess. We sat down. And you mean to tell me you don't think she's a werewolf? Said Spencer. Who's a werewolf? Said a voice at the table just behind us. I turned around. It was Vernon. Vernon Manchufel, the rich kid in our class who sweats a lot. He's the biggest blabbermouth in school, and he's always trying to get me in trouble. His tray was loaded with food, mostly desserts. Nobody's a werewolf, Manchufel, I said. Nobody? Vernon repeated. But I distinctly heard you say that Mrs. Wolfowitz ate your homework. And I distinctly heard Spencer say that she was a werewolf. If you distinctly heard us say that, I said, then why did you ask? I wanted to be sure, said Vernon. Boy, wait till I tell the kids in class that our substitute teacher is a werewolf. Please don't do that, Vernon, I said. Why not? He asked. Because you wouldn't want to get an innocent woman in trouble. She doesn't sound so innocent to me, said Vernon. What did you do when she ate your homework? Look, I said, I really don't want this to go any further. If I tell you what happened, will you promise not to tell anybody else? On my word of honor, said Vernon. On his word of honor. That was a laugh, the idea that Vernon Manchufel had any honor. It was probably a stupid idea to trust him to do anything, but I never seemed to learn. So I told him everything that happened. And, in front of me and Spencer, he swore on his word of honor that he wouldn't tell. Well, if he did, I'd tell everybody Vernon was a bedwetter. Chapter 3. That night, I told my dad what happened to my homework. Dad is great. He always understands whatever I tell him. I don't understand, Zack, said Dad. You think your teacher is a werewolf just because she ate your homework? Maybe she just likes to eat paper. Some people do. I never heard of anybody who liked to eat paper, I said. Really? Said Dad. I've been known to nibble paper myself. Especially if I'm writing an article and it isn't going too well. It's kind of a nervous habit. Just don't see why eating your homework makes her a werewolf. Well, that wasn't the only thing, I said. Also, she's very dark and very hairy. You know the stubble you get on your cheeks after you shave your beard? Well, it's all over her face, even on her nose. And she doesn't stand up straight. She kind of crouches. And she has these really long teeth. I know lots of people who are dark and hairy, who don't stand up straight, and who have long teeth, said Dad. But none of them is a werewolf. At least none of them has bitten me. The biting probably comes next, I said. Anyway, Dad, it doesn't matter whether you believe she's a werewolf or not. What I'm trying to tell you is that the principal wants to see both of us in his office tomorrow morning. At 8 a.m. sharp. Is Mrs. Wolfowitz going to be there, too? I don't know. Why? Well, said Dad, if she is, maybe I can interview her. I've never done an interview with a werewolf before. By the time we got to the principal's office the next morning, I was pretty nervous. I didn't know what the principal would do to me if we couldn't convince him I was telling the truth. Well, thanks for coming, sir, said Mr. Underpants, shaking hands with Dad. Sit down, sit down. Dad and I both sat down opposite the principal. Good, said Mr. Underpants. Now, Zack, tell us what happened. I already told you, I said. Mrs. Wolfowitz ate my homework. Said Mr. Underpants. I see you haven't changed your story. Why should I change my story? I said. That's what happened. The principal turned to Dad. What do you say about this? He asked. If Zack says his teacher ate his homework, then I believe him, said Dad. The principal frowned. I think he tried so hard to get Mrs. Wolfowitz as a teacher, he now refused to hear anything bad about her. Would I have to say I made up the story about Mrs. Wolfowitz, so I wouldn't be suspended? Have you asked Mrs. Wolfowitz about this matter? Dad asked. You mean, have I asked her whether she ate a student's homework? Right, said Dad. Well, of course not, said Mr. Underpants. That would be insulting. Don't you think it's insulting to Zack to believe he's lying to you? Dad asked. But Zack is a child, said Mr. Underpants. Mrs. Wolfowitz is an adult. So you automatically take an adult's side against a child's, said Dad. That doesn't sound as though you have a high opinion of children. Which would be a disappointing thing to see in a principal. I wonder what the school's board of directors would think about that. A little vein stood out on the principal's forehead.